Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradhari Jaya Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradhari Yashodanandana Brajajana Ranjana Yashodanandana Brajajana Ranjana Yamunatira Vanachare Yamunatira Vanachare Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradhari Jaya Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradhari Yashodanandana Brajajana Ranjana Yashodanandana Brajajana Ranjana Yamunatira Vanachare Yamunatira Vanachare Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Jaya Radha Govinda Shri Radhe Jaya Radha Govinda Radha Govinda Shri Radhe. Srila Prabhupada ki, Grantara Srimad Bhāgavatam ki, Go Premanande. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. We are reading today from the third canto of the Srimad Bhāgavatam, chapter 20, entitled Conversations between Maitreya and Vidura. And we're looking at text number 10 until 12. So I'll just read the Sanskrit and the English for 10 and 11, and then we can chant together number 12, which has a purport. Ye marityada yo vipra yastu swayam bhuvo manu devai brahmana adeshat katam me tat abhavayan. Vidura inquired, how did the Prajapatis, such progenitors of living entities as Marichi and Swayambhuva Manu, create according to the instruction of Brahma? And how did they evolve this manifested universe? Saditiya kimasrijan swatantra utakarmasu ahusvit sanghata sarva idam swa samakalpayan. Did they evolve the creation in conjunction with their respective wives? Did they remain independent in their action? Or did they all jointly produce it? And text number 12. Maitreya vacha Daivene durvitarkyena Parena nimishena cha Jatakshobat bhagavato Mahan asit gunatraya. Maitreya vacha Daivena durvitarkyena Parena nimishena cha Jatakshobhat bhagavato Mahan asit gunatrayad. Maitreya vacha Daivena durvitarkyena Parena nimishena cha Jatakshobhat bhagavato Mahan asit gunatrayad. Durvitarkena Parena nimishena cha Jatakshobat bhagavato Mahanasit gunatrayat. Maitreya vacha Daivena durvitarkyena Parena nimishena cha Jatakshobhat bhagavato Mahan asit gunatrayat. Maitreya vacha Maitreya said, Daivena, by superior management, known as destiny, Durvitarkyena, beyond empiric speculation, Parena, by Mahavishnu, Animishena, by the potency of eternal time. Cha and Jatakshobhad, the equilibrium was agitated. Bhāgavatam, of the personality of Godhead. Mahan, the total material elements. The Mahatattva, Asit, were produced. Gunatrayad, from the three modes of nature. Translation. Maitreya said, when the equilibrium of the combination of the three modes of nature was agitated by the unseen activity of the living entity, by Mahavishnu and by the force of time, the total material elements were produced. Purport. The cause of the material creation is described here very lucidly. The first cause is Daiva, or the destiny of the conditioned soul. The material creation exists for the conditioned soul who wanted to become a false lord for sense enjoyment. One cannot trace out the history of when the conditioned soul first desired to lord it over material nature, but in Vedic literature we always find that the material creation is meant for the sense enjoyment of the conditioned soul. There is a nice verse which says that the sum and substance of the conditioned soul's sense enjoyment is that as soon as he forgets his primary duty, to render service to the Lord, he creates an atmosphere of sense enjoyment, which is called Maya. That is the cause of material creation. Another word used here is Durvitarkyena. No one can argue about when and how the conditioned soul became desirous of sense enjoyment, but the cause is there. Material nature is an atmosphere meant only for the sense enjoyment of the conditioned soul, and it is created by the personality of Godhead. It is mentioned here that in the beginning of the creation, the material nature, or Prakriti, is agitated by the personality of Godhead, Vishnu. There are three Vishnus mentioned. One is Mahavishnu, another is Garbhodakashaya Vishnu, and the third is Kshirodakashaya Vishnu. The first canto of Srimad Bhāgavatam discusses all these three Vishnus, and here also it is confirmed that Vishnu is the cause of creation. From Bhagavad Gita also we learn that Prakriti begins to work, and is still working under Krishna's or Vishnu's glance of superintendence, but the Supreme Personality of Godhead is unchangeable. One should not mistakenly think that because the creation emanates from the Supreme Personality of Godhead, he has therefore transformed into this material cosmic manifestation. He exists in his personal form always, but the cosmic manifestation takes place by his inconceivable potency. The workings of that energy are difficult to comprehend, but it is understood from Vedic literature that the conditioned soul creates his own destiny and is offered a particular body by the laws of nature under the superintendence of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who always accompanies him as Paramatma. Om Jnana-timirandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobisham Sahagna Lalita Shri Vishakan Parena Nimishena Cha Jatakshobhat Bhagavato Mahan Asit Gunatrayat. When the equilibrium of the combination of the three modes of nature was agitated by the unseen activity of the living entity, by Mahavishnu and by force of time, the total material elements were produced. So Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur explains that the various cantos of the Bhagavatam, though not exclusively dealing with specific subjects, they have, each of them generally divides up, that they focus on a specific, one of the specific subjects that the Puranas are supposed to elucidate on. So the Puranas are said to speak about 10 various subject matters, and the first two of which is creation, Sarga and Visarga. So the third canto, we see specifically, has to deal with the topic of creation. Now, creation is very interesting because in one sense, we understand that the goal of our life is ultimately to become liberated from material energy. So one could therefore ask why so much attention is given on understanding the creation. But it is, we'll see that an immense amount of energy, an immense amount of focus is given on understanding the material creation, and actually in quite a technical way, to understand how it's all put together, what it is composed about. And the real goal of it is to help us reform or could say, reorientate ourselves towards what the world really is. When we are born into the world, as we just chanted, Om Ajnana Timirandasya, one is born into the darkness of ignorance. What that means is that we are born into this world, but we cannot properly understand what the world is simply by existing in it. That is the difficulty of material energy. You're born into it, and you look at it, and you sort of grow up, and by the time that you are sort of able to think for yourself and speak for yourself, your whole life is more or less already taken on a certain kind of form, a certain kind of momentum, a certain kind of trajectory. You've learned so many things already from your parents, and all these things will just now start to play out. But the main mistake that one makes, unless one is blessed with transcendental knowledge, is that we enter into this world and we naturally assume that the world is meant for our enjoyment. Now, while most of us might not think that it sounds quite selfish if we say it like that, oh, I think the world is meant for my enjoyment. But practically, that is how we relate with the world, because we all have our plans, and our plans in the material world for our life is generally tended on trying to fulfill as many of our desires as possible. And that's what we are planning on. That's when we look at the world. We think, well, that's what I am supposed to get out of the world. That is our expectation that we expect from the world. We expect that the world is going to bestow upon me wonderful experiences, wonderful events, and wonderful things. And whatever those wonderful things are, that will be determined by your specific conditioning, what kind of desires you were born into. Some people just want something comfortable. Some people want a lot of power. Some people want a lot of money, or whatever it is. So we have different things, but we all are hoping and expecting that that is what this world will give to us. But the Vedic vision, that what one gets if one can be blessed by the Vedic understanding, is that our relationship with the world is completely changed. And our expectation of the world also differs. And we understand that this world is not ultimately designed to fulfill our desires, but it is actually designed to purify us from the desire to enjoy separately from Krishna. That's what the world is, that's what it's designed for. So now you can see for many people, even in religious, if you study the philosophy of religion, you see that the main problem that we have in the philosophy of religion when it comes to the belief in God, so it's called the problem of evil. And evil doesn't necessarily mean like some person who is evil, but it means suffering, the problem of suffering. How exactly can we harmonize the idea of a loving, powerful God with the reality of suffering in this world? And then different people try to sort of do different things, do philosophical arguments. It's called apologetics. So trying to find a way to justify our belief in God. But many of them you will see, oftentimes they go from the understanding that there's something wrong with the world and trying to explain what is wrong with the world. But from the Vedic perspective there's nothing wrong with the world. The world is designed and it's fulfilling its function actually quite well. And when you read the creation, you understand that this thing is designed out and it's planned out and it is perfectly conceived from beginning to end. What its function is, just like if you're into engineering, I once met a devotee in Mayapur, very big programmer, serious programmer. So what happened to him is, he was just really into programming, and someone gave him a third canto actually on the street. Sometimes the book distributors do, they just distribute random cantos on the street. So he got a third canto, and he started to read about creation. Like he went home and he took out the book and he started to read it, and then he was from Latvia, so very super intelligent kind of ethereal kind of person. He was reading this, and then he just had this moment where he said, "This is subject-orientated programming." He's like, "This is just how you program, just how you do a computer program." He realized that the whole world is it's designed by an engineer, by a programmer. And what's being described here is the various definitions of all the various elements that make up the world, and then their relationships and their interactions and how they compound, and that's what it is. That's exactly what it is. It's exactly what it is. It's designed by an engineer. Lord Brahma is ultimately could be said to be, he is the engineer of the universe. Prabhupada also sometimes uses that term, because he himself does not create anything. He does not create the subject, the building blocks what he works with, but he is the one that defines all the elements in one sense and then puts them together. And so from that perspective then, when we read about the creation, we realize there's nothing wrong with the world. What is wrong is our expectation of the world. And so long as you have the wrong expectation of this world, then you will experience great frustration. Then your suffering will also not have its desired effect. And we also understand then that if we can be in harmony with the purpose of the universe, then we also mitigate a lot of unnecessary suffering. That is one thing also, that the world is not designed to make us suffer per se. The world is designed to respond to our desires. And when we start to desire, Prabhupada explained that all suffering, the root cause of suffering, is extravagance, the desire to live extravagantly. That is when we start to compound and add on to our suffering. But it's not a fault in the world, it is designed like that. It is designed like that to help us minimize and simplify. So this basic understanding of what the world is, what it is designed for, and what our relationship with the world is, you have to understand that before you can understand anything about spiritual culture or even spiritual practice. If you do not understand that, what the world is, what its purpose is, then when you look at spiritual culture, it doesn't make sense. And then you will see now, for example, you look at any kind of traditional culture, and traditional cultures come from an era in which people had a general understanding that the purpose of life, of human life, is ultimately to become liberated, and that this world in which we are living is not our ultimate destination, and that the world in which we are living is actually dangerous, that there's an element of danger here, that you have to be a little careful with how you relate with your desires with the world, because you can get trapped and you can end up causing a lot of unnecessary suffering to yourself. And that was what the religious mentality was all about. People didn't necessarily put so much faith in their own desires, and they didn't just think that the world is going to fulfill all their desires. And their traditional cultures was built around that. So therefore traditional cultures, there's all these rules of like cleanliness, rules of propriety, how the sexes behave with one another. Like think about any traditional culture, there's some kind of a separation, keeping men and women apart, because we know that there's danger there. Once men and women starts to mix unrestrictedly, you can get into so many unfortunate circumstances. But now if you would look at the world, like if you look at Netflix or whatever, you'll see, for example, is that some big show that came out about the Orthodox Jews, like we have the Hasidic Jewish community here in Williamsburg. Now, for whatever their philosophy, I don't know so much about. I haven't really got into Judaism. But their culture is just like very traditional religious culture. Everybody dresses a specific way, very strict understanding of how people relate with one another, strict rules of behavior. But then what is glorified is how people run away or break away from traditional culture. And even in the Hare Krishna movement, you'll find that, people make their videos, how I left the Hare Krishna movement, and then they'll say like how, like the temple was so, just repressing my individual desire and my freedom, and I wanted to grow a beard and like whatever, all these things that come. So how traditional culture then, it doesn't really make sense if you're thinking that the world is meant, that your goal in life is meant to maximize whatever your specific idea is of what material happiness looks like, then traditional culture doesn't make sense. And the Hare Krishna movement also really won't make sense. You'll get into it and you won't understand why it is like it is. So renunciation can only really be understood if we understand what the world is and how it works. But then it also has to be understood that there's a fine balance, because it is also possible for traditional culture to become too repressive. And that also is there. It's not like I'm not arguing for, sometimes you see people in these highly orthodox communities and you think, wow, it does look a little bit, there's not a lot of scope for creativity and expression. So it's very interesting with our movement, because our movement is in one hand like very strict. The Hare Krishna movement is like we have very strict ideals that we live towards, and we have a lot of elements, a lot of things that are geared towards renunciation. But on the other side, we have this interesting element that is very colorful and very creative, and we have this element that there's also ecstasy is also supposed to be there. So very fascinating how our movement combines sort of two things. Ecstasy and expression and creativity is highly encouraged, and we see that Srila Prabhupada also, he was a great, when devotees would do creative things like dramas or do music and stuff, he would be a great supporter. He really loved it, and that was the goal. Our goal is just to have a festival every day. But on the other side, to protect our purity, we have to be a little bit careful with how we relate with the world. So these two things have to come together. That's all part of understanding the creation, understanding what the world is and how to relate with it, so that we do not get carried away by the illusion ultimately, as Maharaj spoke about yesterday, as we also come to here soon in the next few verses, explaining how it's one of the basic things that were created were illusion. So this is important because you will see that a lot of the disharmony, like we know in Kali Yuga, it is the age of quarrel, the age of quarrel and the age of hypocrisy. And a lot of the quarrel that people have is because of the wrong expectations. The wrong expectations. So clarifying our expectations and understanding what our duties are is really can solve a lot of problems in life. If you're a brahmachari, your expectations and you understanding what is your relationship with other people in the ashram. If you get married also, to understand what is your expectations of marriage, and understand that it is very serious responsibilities. That's really what it is all about. Any ashram that you take up, the basis of it is not your rights. It's not like now we live in a culture which is defined by rights. It's about the rights of the individual. But in traditional culture, Vedic culture specifically, if you look at dharma, dharma is not defined by rights, it is defined by duties. Because the idea is there, if everyone fulfills their duties, then there will be the fruits of that. There will be the fruit of that. So if you get married, for example, and that we'll see, interestingly enough, in this same canto, we saw in the beginning, there was the whole pastime of Hiranyaksha and Hiranyakashipu, or Hiranyakashipu's brother, which is very interesting because he is the personification of that individual who tries to tap as much out of the material energy as possible. And we saw that he sucked the earth planet dry. Prabhupada said it's just like with oil. Prabhupada said it's an interesting thing, almost like people who mine oil. They just mine out of the earth. And what do they do with that oil? They just then drive cars and do stuff and build things. And it's this very tamasic, rajasic civilization that's all based on exploiting the earth and taking from the earth. Prabhupada said just like a vampire almost, sucking the blood of earth. And that's what our civilization, that's what the modern civilization is to a large part. And that's what we're seeing. Everybody is looking at it, but no one can stop it. Because we all like the conveniences that have come from modern civilization. We all like what it offers us. Yet no one likes to see what it's doing. And then you'll see people make documentaries about it, and you can see how many forests are being chopped down. And then that's what we read about here in Yaksha. At a certain point, it became such a crisis that what happened is the earth fell out of its orbit. Because the whole balance of the earth was upset, and then the earth fell out of its orbit. And then we see Lord Varaha came. And Lord Varaha came and he lifted the earth back up. And what's very interesting is if you see about Lord Varahadev, he was the one who defeated Hiranyaksha. He defeated him. He defeated that. Hiranyaksha means an eye of gold, a golden eye. Like just looking at money. He looks at the world, what can he get for money? And that's what we see, like the desire for money. It's amazing what people can do. You read about there was a car came out, and they found out that this car, after it has been released and it was sold, thousands of units were sold, they found out that there's some problem in the car, that 1 out of every 20,000 cars will basically just spontaneously combust. There was a problem with the fuel system or whatever, and it will just catch fire. And there's a big problem, obviously, because people are going to die because the car will just randomly go up in flames. But then what they did is they realized, but they've already sold so many, probably already sold 1 million. So what they did is they came together and they crunched the numbers. So they look, well, what will cost us more? The money that we will lose if we pull back all these cars off the market, or the money that we will lose if we will get sued from however many people will die because of, going up into flames. And they saw that it's going to be much cheaper actually just to pay the lawsuits than it will be to retract the car. So they decided, well, let's just pay them when it comes. We'll pay them, and the figures are going to balance out. So that is demoniac, you understand? But it's not like it's not necessarily that they have fans or they slaughter little children or whatever. No, it comes from a very rational motivation of just trying to maximize your profits at any extent. If if the only thing you can see is the bottom line, then you will do stuff like that. It will come, and then at the end, the result is that people will go up in flames. They will burn to death in their cars. But it's not that they wanted to burn people alive, but at the end, when they had to choose between profit and death, they choose profit. So that is Hiranyaksha, the Hiranyaksha mentality. And we see that Hiranyaksha was destroyed ultimately by his own activities, and Lord Varaha killed him. But what do we see with Lord Varaha? I find something fascinating. Lord Varaha, oftentimes we will see later, I think even in this canto, when he appeared, we will see that there was the prayers of the rishis, that the rishis, when he appeared, they glorify him. And what is he glorified as? You will find that again and again, Lord Varaha is glorified as the personification of sacrifice, the Yajna Purusha. He is always glorified. We'll say that the hairs of his body is composed of kusha grass. And the eyes of he says that how the holes of his body, it's all like the containers in which you throw ghee into the fire. So they have all these interesting glorifications where he is symbolized as the Vedic sacrificial process. Now why is that? Because sacrifice in the Vedic sense, that is the way, yajna, that is how your desires, for whatever you want within this world, your desires that are directed into this world, is transformed and ultimately redirected towards Krishna. So for example, we see something like marriage. Marriage is, what is it called? It's called the Vivaha Yajna. It is a sacrifice that one makes. Why? Because one has a desire, there's that natural attraction for the opposite sex, but then one does it according to the Vedic process, which means you do it with a sense of duty and responsibility in the forefront of your consciousness. And when you enter into that relationship, you understand that my purpose here is to fulfill my obligations towards my spouse. That is my primary duty, is to fulfill the obligations that is set by God, that decides how this thing is supposed to work. What is our mutual duties? Similarly, if one enters brahmachari ashram, why are you a brahmachari? It is supposed to be, you enter into it understanding, I have to make my sacrifice. The ashram is meant to facilitate your sacrifice. But because for example, you have a desire for freedom, or you have a desire to get learned, or you have a desire to do so many things, well, then the ashram facilitates that, and you have to follow the duties of the ashram. So sacrifice takes our desires, and it transforms them, and it directs them towards Krishna. We see, and therefore we see later here, the next section of this canto, we will deal with the pastime of Kardama Muni. So Kardama Muni, who was then a great yogi, who decided to become, who then entered into Grihastha life. First he was for a long time a sage, and he desired to get married, and he got married, and then he went through a whole process, and we see that whole thing described, how he ultimately dealt with desire, and how it was greatly auspicious. And some amazing purports Prabhu also writes there about understanding this dynamic. And what is fascinating is we will see that Swayambhuva Manu, who was the father of Devahuti, we will see at a certain point that Swayambhuva Manu, he will come and he will give his daughter to Kardama Muni, and then he will return back to his city, and his city is called Barishmati. And Barishmati, what is the city of Barishmati? Where does it come from? It came from when Lord Varaha appeared within this world. When he was fighting Varaha, when he was fighting Hiranyaksha, at a certain point, it's when he dived down into the cosmic waters, and he lifted the earth planet up. And then, because he was wet, so then he shook his body, like a pig or a dog. You see, they can shake their body, and then some hair, it fell, and where that hair fell of Lord Varaha, one of those hair, it fell at Barishmati. And that is where Kusha grass comes from. And Swayambhuva Manu's city is built on that place. So it's very interesting how this theme of Lord Varaha, actually the whole canto is connected towards one another. The pastime of Hiranyaksha, then the description of the creation of the universe, and then also then the understanding of Kardama Muni and Kapila Muni. It's all part of the same pastime. It's not just like this random collection of chapters that come together. It's connected, and the theme is the principle of sacrifice. And essential, before you can understand what sacrifice is and how to properly perform it, you have to understand creation, because the world was created for two purposes. One purpose is it gives the jivas the opportunity to enjoy whatever the specific desires are, but it also facilitates the practice of sacrifice. And that same desire that we have, that desire is also the fuel of your sacrifice. Without desire, you cannot do anything. So even in the brahmachari ashram or in the household ashram, whatever your desire is, you have to work with that desire. If you desire to be learned, if you want knowledge, then enter into the brahmachari ashram and become learned in scripture. But you're not going to be learned in scripture if you don't have a desire to become learned. But that desire has to be connected with the process of sacrifice. And so sacrifice and creation really go well together, and that's what this whole canto is ultimately all about. And by understanding that desire that is not going to be directed towards sacrifice, that desire is the desire that will slowly develop something extremely ugly, and which we see in the example of Hiranyaksha, where that same with the desire that is not connected to the sacrificial process is desire that becomes degrading, and desire that ultimately causes suffering, not just to yourself, but also to everyone else. And that's what we're seeing now in Kali Yuga. Like in Kali Yuga, because there's no conception of sacrifice, there's no conception of any of these austerities that are required in the Vedic process. Therefore, people are going crazy. Their desires are going crazy. Their desires also cannot be fulfilled. We see so many people, they desire, for example, to be married, but because they're so selfish and because they're so unregulated and because they're so, they have no qualities, they cannot even sustain a relationship. So therefore, they cannot even satisfy their desire to just be married, because you have to pay the price for any of these things. So desire, now in Kali Yuga, because there is no ability to perform sacrifice, people are being driven to madness through their desires that will be unfulfilled and frustrated. They cannot satisfy even their material desires, and therefore they are going completely crazy. And Prabhupada said in Krishna consciousness, that is really our goal in our philosophy. The goal of our way of life is to help us become freed from desires that cannot be fulfilled. Prabhupada says a sinful desire, what is the definition of a sinful desire? Is it a desire that can never be satisfied? And that's what we see. Intoxication, so many of these things, they can never be satisfied. That one just becomes addicted, and then even if you don't want to do it, you're forced to do it again. So those things will become freed from all sinful desire. And whatever desire is left, that desire can be accommodated within the framework of the Krishna conscious way of life. And it can all be expressed in a very natural way and in a safe way, because it's all connected to the sacrificial process of ultimately connecting everything with Krishna. And in this way, the devotees, interestingly enough, are the only individuals who can fulfill both their material and spiritual desires. Because even your material desires cannot be fulfilled if you are not going to have the mercy of Krishna, and if you're not going to act within the instructions of Krishna, then you will just end up frustrated. And frustration is one of the most dangerous principles, one of the most dangerous things in the mind, because frustration leads to anger and leads ultimately to madness. So it is only in a regulated way of life that is connected to the Vedic process that one can become freed from unnecessary desire, and one can also learn how to fulfill one's authorized desires within a natural way, and then slowly become freed even from any desire and really purify the heart, so that all what is left is the desire to serve Krishna. And that is what all the ashrams and all these various duties and all these rituals and practices that we have in our society, that's what really underlies it. So that's what this canto is all about, to start off with the purpose of the world, so that we can then understand the Vedic culture and the Vedic way of life and see how it all comes together. Okay, let us hear if there are any questions or any comments on anything that's being said today. Nata Bhargaranga.
Okay, I have two questions, but I'll just ask one in case anyone else had anything to say. Someone was asking me that So why do, you were saying in the beginning, like what is the purpose of the world? Some people think the world is, the problem of evil is a big problem and the problem of suffering because they don't understand the purpose of the world. And so someone was asking me, why do saintly people suffer, for example, getting cancer or other things like, you see the end of Prabhupada's life, it seemed like he was suffering, and we see that example many times.
Well, Prabhupada explained in one purport, actually recently read it in the fifth canto of the pastime of Jat Bharat. Prabhupada explained that even the saintly people are not exempt from the sufferings and the tribulations of this material world. Just because you're a saintly person doesn't mean you're not going to grow old and die. Everyone is subjected to that. But the saintly people are freed because ultimately suffering is not merely created from the material conditions, but it is created from the mind's connection to those conditions. And that was what a large part of Jat Bharat's teachings was about, explaining that it is really the suffering, the world just undergoes whatever it undergoes, but it is the mind that is attached. That is where the suffering comes from. So Prabhupada is saying that the saintly people, their freedom from suffering ultimately comes from, it's an internal condition that they are free from. And that's what we saw with Prabhupada. Okay, yes, Prabhupada was sick and he was dying, but look at his state of mind, even at that time, at the end, completely lucid. And so everyone in this world will grow old, get sick and die, except the Lord. Except the Lord, he is completely freed because his body is not material. His body is actually completely spiritual, so he is not subject to those experiences. But the saintly people, they even if they enter into this world purely to come serve, they will still be subjected to a certain extent to the conditions of the material world. But they will be free from suffering because of their great inner detachment. Any other questions? Phil?
Hare Krishna.
Haribo. Yeah, so this kind of cool idea where you think about suffering, desires are your way in and your way out. So if considering that desires are kind of the root of everything, if you're going out, if we're trying to preach to someone, whether they're a guest or you're going out, any tips on how we can figure out what their core desires are so that we can figure out what angle to talk to them from?
Well, Prabhupada explained, I think what's more important is rather the desire of the individual who is doing the preaching. Prabhupada explained that it is the desire to share the glories of Krishna. Prabhupada said that is the basic impetus of all missionary activity. So if that is the desire is simply to connect the individual with the amazing knowledge of Krishna, because Krishna is wonderful and being a devotee of Krishna is wonderful, and that if your desire is simply to connect people with that, that is the most important thing. Other people's desires, yes, people have many ideas and these kind of things, but one will only really be eligible, it's only to the extent that one is really interested in Krishna or interested in connecting with Krishna that one can be able to enter into the devotional society. So working with other people's, then we all come in and we have different desires that need to be satisfied, but at least from the preacher's perspective, those things come later. Just your own sincere desire to share, to just spread the glories of Krishna to this individual, that is the main route. And then Krishna will inspire you with the intelligence by which how to connect with people and relate with them. But it is important to relate with people properly. You see expert preachers probably explain that when you see the expert preacher, he has this, I think I watched this purport, it's probably speaking about Narada Muni, and you see that that's his specific ability, that he can connect with all kinds of individuals. And the expert preacher, he is able to connect all kinds of people with Krishna's service. But that comes from Krishna's empowerment, like just by understanding other people's psychology and these things. People are very complicated, really. To understand how people work, we need some empowerment from Krishna and some sincere desire in our own heart to be able to relate with people. And usually, the thing that blocks us from being able to relate with other people is our own, one could say, subversive desires. For example, I know this one devotee, he really liked to preach, but you can see that what he liked about preaching is that he liked this experience of knowing more than other people. you know. So then, and when he preached, that really came off strongly, that this guy's like, you know, I know all these things that you don't know, and I can tell them to you, you know. And that attitude, then people pick up on that, and people are like, oh, I don't like this guy, he just thinks he's puffed up, he just thinks he knows more than I do. So understand, it's our own, but if people can feel, wow, this guy is just, he's really into something, and he really wants to share it with me, people pick up on that sincerity, and then they're willing to give you a fair listening. So that's Prabhupada's understanding. That's why the purity of the preacher is the main thing that will affect the success of our ability to connect with people. It's actually the purity of the heart, because people connect with that, people can feel that. I mean, you see that's naturally when people heard Prabhupada speak. You see sometimes, there's a few of Prabhupada disciples here, these memories, they would sit in the class, one person is sitting in Prabhupada's class, and he heard Prabhupada speak, but he couldn't understand what Prabhupada is saying because of the Bengali accent, and he couldn't really, but just how Prabhupada said it, and he could see that, he could feel Prabhupada's mood, just like Prabhupada is like really a realized person. He has something very important to say, and that he really is only here because he really wants you to hear what he's saying. And like he could feel that, and then he was like, okay, I'm going to become a devotee. I don't know what this guy said, or like, you know, I don't understand anything, but he could just feel the impact of Prabhupada's desire and attitude was ultimately what convinced him. So very interesting.
It's funny, it almost feels like, because I heard something else where I think it was a couple went to him, and they said, and they were saying something about how they were having problems, and he just said, just come to my class and everything will be solved, and they were convinced to actually do it. And I was thinking, like, it almost feels like we talk, like us going and speaking words is an excuse to, like, people feel how much we love God, and that convinces them. It almost feels like how much we know and what we say isn't that serious as much as how pure we've become. So like, how do you reconcile that?
The two are connected, you know. Purity comes from knowledge. Knowledge, there's no, unless when, you know, you have this example of people, for example, who are not really, say, just simple-hearted and they don't need any knowledge, but in general, we see that knowledge is what helps us remain pure, and it also purifies the heart. Srinvatam swakata Krishna punya shravana kirtanam marityanta stoya badrani vidunoti suritsatam. It is hearing the Bhāgavatam, that knowledge is what purifies the heart. That's spiritual knowledge. It's not necessarily understanding Sanskrit or this or that, but the knowledge that comes from Bhāgavatam, from understanding these pastimes, from being absorbed in that is what will give the purity in the heart. So knowledge and purification are very intimately related. Spiritual knowledge and purification, because we see that it's also possible to be a genius and be completely impure in terms of the material characteristics, but spiritual knowledge specifically, that is what the symptoms. Prabhupada said, what is the mark of knowledge? What is the test of your knowledge? Is the reduction of your material desires. That's how we will see how learned you really are. So our conception of knowledge is that, like, are you realized, which means that yes, you can see what is really important and what is not important. So that's what the Bhāgavatam tries to teach us. So if we approach the Bhāgavatam with a desire, if the desire behind our studying is the purification of our heart, then that knowledge will stick and it will become important. But if you're simply gathering knowledge, like Rupa Goswami himself says, it's one of the things that are Bahu Grantha, I can't remember the Sanskrit, says that how simply learning many books, reading many books, just to have many books and many different arguments that you can give in your classes, even if it's spiritual books, he says even that should be abandoned. Prabhupada says, better to just take one book and really learn it properly for the desire to purify your heart, become really realizing Bhagavad Gita or Bhagavatam instead of reading so many different books, because then the desire is just, you want to quote, you want to appear very learned. So knowledge can be, that kind of knowledge is not going to help you, but don't think that real knowledge, don't think that, oh, I don't really have to study Bhagavatam, I can just go out and by my sincere desire I can preach to people. No, it is your sincerity will be protected by being absorbed in spiritual knowledge. That is, these two things come together. Divyangi.
Thank you for the nice class. I was just happened to hear one point in the morning from disciples of Srila Prabhupada about the point about the preaching. the sincerity, what you were talking about, that they wanted to kind of find out how to teach people, how to teach other devotees, how to distribute books, and they wanted to put this drama that, kind of pretend I'm devotee, I'm not devotee, so I stop you on the street, and it end up, with the book taken. Yeah. And they told Prabhupada about this, that, Prabhupada, we want to put this drama. And he said, no, that's all right, you don't have to do this. You just teach them how to be sincere. And if they're sincere, Krishna is in their heart, he will guide them, the way they need to, distribute books or preach, whatever it is. So just to prove your point.
yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's exactly, that's Prabhupada's approach to these things. Yes.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu.
Yes.
Very amazing class, as always. I really appreciated this one point when you were talking about tradition in Vedic culture especially, and how sometimes that tradition is extremely important, but when you have too much repressiveness, it actually limits individuality, and it actually makes it impersonal. And so I was really appreciating what philosophy is. But I also had a question. You mentioned about expectations, and actually it's like the issue is our expectations we're creating in the world. That's what's actually the issue. And so I was thinking, about, you talked about making expectations in spiritual life, the ashram that we're entering in, but sometimes those expectations can be really far out there, and we can end up being disappointed. Or, especially creating like expectations of other devotees or other peers, like, is that a proper thing to have? How do we like navigate that properly?
Yeah, well, there's two ways to curb our expectations. The one is through knowledge, and the other one is through disappointment. So the material world, there's this interesting, if you read Shama Sundar's book, Chasing Rhinos with the Swami, then you see at a certain point Shama Sundar, he really got into gold. Like he was starting to buy and sell gold, he got into, and he was like, obviously he had some karma for that. And then some devotees were complaining that Shama Sundar, he was getting into these things and it's not proper. And then it's interesting how Prabhupada dealt with the situation, because on one hand, Prabhupada sort of actually went with him. When he told Prabhupada about this thing, then Prabhupada went with him to Switzerland, to a bank in Switzerland, to see what exactly is happening. And then Prabhupada ended up opening his own bank account there also. And then he, Shama Sundar transferred whatever profits he made from the gold price he gave to Prabhupada. And Prabhupada didn't tell people after, says, yes, I have a Swiss bank account. And, but actually Prabhupada would, from other people, he would say, we shouldn't do this. But then Prabhupada was sort of encouraging Shama Sundar, but you can later see what came out is that Prabhupada understood that he's super into it. So Prabhupada sort of let him do it, and then he told another disciple, he said, yes, Shama Sundar still has some illusions that have to be smashed. And then we see Shama Sundar Prabhu then later, he ended up, you can see in his life, when he writes it in his biography, how at a certain point he was, he did some amazing things with diamonds and gold and finding stuff, and he ended up at one point having a big mine, one of the biggest gem mines in North America, somewhere in Montana. And then he got sued and he lost everything, and his wife divorced him, and it was this heavy thing. And then he said at that point, then he realized, he's like, okay, now I'm done. Like I went for the whole thing. I had this plan, this dream that I'm going to become rich and become a millionaire by speculating in gold and diamonds and stuff. And then you see, by actual practical experience, he then decided, okay, I'm done with that. So the material world is also sometimes designed like that. Sometimes you have to go for something. Sometimes people have to go for something, and then the experience of what comes from that will also give realization. Understand? So by experience also we can adjust our expectations. Yeah? So that's also there. I mean, it's not necessarily specific, maybe more extreme examples than what you were speaking about, like our expectations in the temple or whatever. But it's all related to the principle. It's based on experience. We start becoming a little more mature. Even our expectations of ourselves. A large part of also Krishna consciousness is that we go for these high ideals, and at a certain point we also start to experience our own limitations. And like we realize what we are and what we are not. So by experience, it's important. By experience, we learn certain things. And even the Hare Krishna movement, sometimes you enter, like you can see Prabhupada, so many letters he got by people having their complaints or their problems with ISKCON. The problems in ISKCON. You can follow a whole book and you can say, these are the problems, or in any temple you can go into. You go, oh, this is the problem, this is the problem. And then, but at a certain point, like you could see Prabhupada encourage his disciples just to become mature and say, listen, like there's this one class where he was in Brazil, big class, everybody's there, and some Mataji stood up in the back of the class and she was very angry. And he said, Prabhupada, in this temple, there is Maya. And then Prabhupada just folded his hands. He says, if you know of some place where there is no Maya, then let us go there immediately. I said, so basically just telling her, what to do. Like, nothing is going to be perfect. There is no utopia. So Prabhupada also would say that in one letter. There's no utopia in the material world. So when you take on a service, don't think that, oh, now I've taken up the service, so now I will be saved from any kind of material difficulty. Not at all. Not at all. Look at Prabhupada's example. Look at what Prabhupada had to do to get the land in Mumbai. Crazy legal battles, intense things. At a certain point he looked at even Tamal Krishna Maharaj looked at Prabhupada. When the whole thing was going on for a long time, Tamal Krishna Maharaj looked at Prabhupada and says, Prabhupada, I have to be honest, sometimes I can't even eat. I'm so worried about this thing. Because it's millions of so much dollars in the wager and this big legal battle. And Prabhupada said, yeah, me neither. Sometimes I also can't eat. It's just so intense, this thing. So what is that? So, that's why to understand that taking suffering for Krishna is really a big part of the whole thing. That's when your expectations become in line. Yes, we are here because we're going to suffer together. And we're going to deal with the difficulties, like living communally, living alone, building up a temple. Yes, you're going to deal with the hard realities of life, the realities of financial difficulties. No one will be freed from the troubles that come from the material world. That's not what we're promising you. We're not saying that if you come here, you will be exempt from the sufferings that come from living in the material world. But what we are telling you is that here your suffering will become meaningful. Like when you become a devotee, all the suffering and the tribulation that you suffer in pursuit of your spiritual ideas, that suffering has purpose behind it. There's a purpose and it will purify you and it will actually bring you closer to Krishna. That's what we can offer you. But we cannot offer you any freedom from suffering. We cannot offer you any freedom from disappointment either. But for a devotee, it all is connected to Krishna. And therefore, it all becomes part of the relationship that Krishna has with the devotee, ultimately, in order to purify us and to correct our mentalities. And that is really what it is about. Suffering is not the problem. It is meaningless suffering. The meaningless suffering that you see that materialistic people suffer as they pursue their meaningless goals that will not bring them any satisfaction, and as they suffer the consequences of their sinful actions, and they're just being hit by the material energy. That is tragic. That is tragic and useless. But the sufferings of the devotees is glorious. So that's what we have to understand. We're not interested in, if you look at Prabhupada, you can see Prabhupada is not interested in being comfortable. Prabhupada is not interested in being freed from suffering. But Prabhupada was glorious. That's what it was. So, like a good friend of mine said, he called me once, very dramatic person, and he just said, I was asking him, how's it going? And he's not a devotee, but he has some appreciation for Krishna consciousness, and then he just told me, he said, Hari, there is no glory in the modern world. That was his realization. As he's trying to figure out his life, he said, there's no glory here. So Krishna consciousness, at least we have that opportunity, so that our suffering can have a little glory behind it. And that's really what we're aiming for. If that is your expectation, then you will not be disappointed. And then you will also not be shocked when the realities of life unfold beneath you. And you won't be disturbed by the inevitable tribulations that you will suffer even as a devotee. Okay, we will end here. Grantara Srimad Bhāgavatam ki, Srila Prabhupada ki, Go